CHistrue, and hopefully this will be an exciting video. I'm going to give it a chance here. I'm not going to do the Jeremiad, the fiery denunciation type of videos I've been doing. I'm going to try to return this to what we've been doing early in the channel, and that is logic and reason-based arguments. I'm going to do a little bit of a review of Minding the Machine by Stephen Rice, and I'm going to try to transition from that into some of the history of free and universal education, and then to maybe some philosophical issues around it if we have the time. This is a must-get, by the way. Minding the Machine by Stephen Rice. And we're discussing the antebellum period of the United States, and particularly the history of working class consciousness in the antebellum period. At that time, there was a very occupation-oriented view of things, where mechanics were mechanics. They were almost like a guild of, not literally, but they met as mechanics, and they had the consciousness of themselves as mechanics. They did not see themselves yet as part of the broader working class, including everybody, nor did wealthier merchants see themselves as part of a more amorphous type ruling class. People tended to be divided on the basis of sectionalism, rural and urban, occupation. And these various local sections had what you could call organic ruling classes. They were, and by organic I mean it in the kind of European sense. We had just won our independence from England, and so a lot of the English aristocratic worldview had not fully left our consciousness as a country, as the United States. We had Federalists, obviously, were very pro-England. And in the South, you had an aristocracy that also had its assumptions of its superiority, and that the idea of a marketplace ideology of, quote, equality of opportunity had not yet become predominant. It would very quickly by the Jacksonian age, and then definitely after the Civil War, would sweep the entire country. But it was, it was back and forth. Definitely what is necessary for a concept of equality of opportunity is this idea of free and universal public education, which we take for granted today, but did not exist in the world at that time. Hence, the development of what were called mechanics institutes was a very fresh and original idea. They were implemented by very forward-thinking capitalists. Now, they had limits as to how forward they were. Remember, they did have, they were forward thinking in the sense of being the most advanced among the bourgeois in terms of their idea that they needed to educate the workers so the workers could control the machines and could know enough math and enough science to be able to be better workers. They did not, of course, favor the idea of an equal society in a more radical sense. But they did favor the idea of some sense of equality of opportunity where people who could rise would rise. In the northern United States, there was very little opposition to mechanics institutes, so they sprang up all around. They had them in England and in Great Britain, but there was more of an opposition, more of a fear that the working people, once they developed their minds, would become radicals, like Cobden, like Thomas Paine. We don't think of Thomas Paine as a fiery working radical in the United States because we sanitized him to the point where even conservatives claim Tom Paine. But in England and in France, he was seen as a working class hero and as a working class leader. So there was some opposition to these mechanics institutes there. And I imagine, even though they had them in the South, one or two at least, that there would be some ambivalence about them in the southern part of the United States also during the antebellum period, for obvious reasons. When you have a slave society, you tend to fear universal literacy. It tends to go together. But in the North, you had that concept of the mechanics institutes, and they were the earliest form of working class college that existed. And they should be praised, and they should be known more about in the history of education. Some sense of the history of the idea of an obligation to educate people. if you go back to the very origins of the country, you had in Virginia, you had the Jeffersonians. Now, Virginia in the 1700s was far more liberal than it would be decades into the 1800s. In particular, even anti-slavery was, you could be anti-slavery in late 1700s Virginia, and it was okay. If you were anti-slavery in the 1830s and 40s, you were driven out, literally. You were driven out on pain of your life. But in the time of the Jeffersonians, you could emancipate your slaves. You could propose emancipation. You could propose things like universal education. It was considered the spirit of the age, the spirit of the idealism of the revolution. Eventually, in the Upper South, but definitely in the North, the most advanced form of bourgeois republicanism was being implemented. There would be no vestige of feudalism, they had hoped at least. And so the idea of universal education was something that was considered essential to having working people being able to participate in a republic. Now, what's curious is that Patrick Henry proposed a law that would have taxed wealthy people to support churches, and the Jeffersonians confronted him and said, well, what are you doing? The federal Constitution separated church and state, and in Virginia, the state constitution was going to do the same thing. How are you going to have state-supported churches? And Patrick Henry said, you're right. You can also support philosophy societies or science societies or universities, more secular institutions. You could have something like what we would today would have be the Planetary Society, where Bill Nye is an agnostic, right, or Neil Tyson. So as long as you're supporting something that is for the public education, and which at that time was inseparable from the idea of moral upliftment. The two were not separated. That was the worldview of the 18th and 19th centuries. Today, we would have a far more radical opposition to this whole idea of universal education in the name of what's called self-ownership. For instance, when the president supports universal community college, we have people who oppose him based on the idea of self-ownership. I happen to believe that he's right. I will oppose a lot of it, let's say his policies on the NDAA or the NSA or the war in Libya. But when he's right about something, I'm going to support it. I think it is a good idea to have universal public education available. As these guys tried to do in here, to have something so that people could rise. But and I see debates between and among particularly left-wing anarchists and right-wing libertarians over this issue of self-ownership. The right-wing libertarians saying, yes, we have self-ownership, and the left-wing libertarians saying, not so fast. What does that mean? I maintain that the whole concept of self-ownership is incomplete in a Gödel sense. And I maintain that because is the self the subject or the object? What is the self? Is the self the owned or the owner? If the self is an object to be owned, then it can be given away. You could sell yourself into slavery, right? Think about it. But if the self is the subject, then the self is an inherent subject, an unmoved mover. And I believe that the 18th century classical liberal idea was of the self as a subject. Now, they were imperfect about it. I would say maybe in the 19th century classical liberalism that shifted a little bit. But in the very early classical Republican, classical liberal concept of the self was as a subject. And the subject had to be refined through education, through self-discipline, through education, moral upliftment, and the rest. And that was the idea of the Mechanics Institute, for all of the flaws and imperfections and class-biased assumptions. I agree. But something of the idea that we are moral beings primarily was there. And education is essential to moral refinement. We need to get back to that idea, in my opinion. So self-ownership is nothing if there's no defined concept of the self as something to improve. CHistrue, signing off.